All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, November 10th, 2024, and this is episode 285 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, sir?
So good it hurts. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm puzzled how it's already November and nearly Thanksgiving, but otherwise I'm doing great.
The year has just gone by in a flash.
It really has. It seems to accelerate.
I'm surprised too.
Yeah. But I see you're at your undisclosed Southern Command location again.
For the final time this year, yes.
Oh, wow. Well, enjoy it while you can.
You know, it's been crazy. It's been super warm here, so it's been really quite nice.
Nice.
But
I think we're heading that way around Thanksgiving to enjoy a couple of days at the beach. But anyway.
Nice. Yeah. It's always good. All right, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. Not yet. It's true. Our first story for today comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Hackers Steal 15,000 Cloud Credentials from Exposed Git Configs.
Wow.
Whew. So there's a malicious actor named Emerald Whale, which I think is pretty cool. Like I do think we have to go with that Jen Easterly advice about naming them, something that's not cool.
So there should be pulsating cyst or something instead.
Exactly. Something along those lines might help a little bit.
Yeah, Emerald Rail sounds like a name from like a Batman, bad guy or something. Or I don't know.
So the issue here is that organizations have been systematically including Git config files in their, roughly speaking, their web directories that get populated to their external websites. And the actor here is using open source tools like Masscan to seek out systems that are both listening to the web, and then they're interrogating directory structures looking for these Git config files, and apparently finding a lot of them that actually contain cloud credentials, which is just amazing.
Yep. Well, sadly, not a huge surprise to me. Honestly, this is a regular, repeated problem that I see over and over again of just secrets management. There's a big, I would say, tension between ease of use and security when it comes to secrets management in infrastructure as code and code in general. And I almost feel like it's an underappreciated problem that I see over and over and over again.
Yeah, so this report this article is written about a report from Sysdig. And Sysdig, interestingly, found that this actor had harvested about 15,000 cloud credentials, which the actor then stored in an S3 bucket that was apparently also collected in the access to the S3 bucket was collected in the same way. But they describe it as 1 terabyte worth of secrets, and I don't know if I can't bridge the gap between 15,000 credentials and a terabyte of data, but
yeah, especially when a secret is a tiny string of code.
Yeah, if you set that to the side for a second, it's interesting that the actor used something that they also stole from one of their victims. And B, the S3 bucket that contained these credentials was apparently exposed, open to the internet. Like they weren't protected. So, hey, badness all the way around.
Right. And I guess on some of these, there was a bunch of API keys or, things like AWS tokens that they could turn around and log right into a bunch of cloud environments with what they were finding in these config files.
Correct. And that, by the way, apparently is what happened, or something very similar is what happened to Internet Archive. I think on the second go around at least.
they had a bad time of it.
They did have a bad time, which is unfortunate. But hey, I mean, even the most sophisticated organizations, well-funded organizations, are falling victim to this sort of thing. So, it sounds like, as they describe in the article, the list of these URLs containing credentials itself is a valuable commodity to be traded. They're saying that the list of URLs is worth about $100, but if you can actually extract legitimate tokens out of that, each one of those tokens would be worth some to be determined amount of money. So my suspicion is that this, if it's not already been industrialized, it's about to be. And I this is something that when I was way back when I was, actually doing something productive, something that I was, quite concerned about seeing up until very recently. Most of the time when these kinds of credentials were stolen and they provided access to cloud accounts, it was used for the purposes of hosting wares or, illegal content or most commonly mining cryptocurrencies, right?
Sure.
So they would spin up a whole bunch of GPUs or virtual servers or Docker containers to mine crypto, and like that was the most benign thing you could possibly do because it was super easy to see that it was going on, and like it wasn't a data breach per se,
Right.
but I think that over time, and we've already started to see it, that the actors are figuring out that they can do a lot more valuable things with these, with the access these credentials provide into cloud accounts. So I think this is an area where, like, the industry, I think, is a bit flat-footed. So
Yeah. There's a whole
Look out.
ecosystem around, initial access resellers, right? So these guys who find this could just turn around and sell this access to this initial access brokers who could then farm it. Like, there's a whole system. Like, they don't even need necessarily go any further with this. Once they discover that, they can turn around and monetize this pretty quickly. And then that could be farmed out to countless other bad actors. The other thing that, just kind of from my notes looking at this article, I kind of took a little bit of exception with. So quoting from the article, they're talking about these git config files such as .git/config or whatnot, and they typically have repository path, branches, remotes, sometimes even authentication information like API keys, access token, passwords. Developers might include these secrets in private repositories for convenience, making data transmission and API interaction easier without configuring or performing authentication each time. Got it. Okay. Here's where I start to really disagree. Quote, "This is not risky as long as the repository is appropriately isolated from public access." End quote. Completely disagree.
I caught that too.
Yeah. These things have a pesky little habit of suddenly becoming public, or, there's a whole thing about, insiders accidentally leaking things or intentionally leaking things, or bad actors getting footholds on, one machine and moving laterally. In general, and this is a lot easier said than done, I think you need to treat these secrets as radioactive. You really don't want them in your code. You really want to be able to have some sort of system to call them securely as needed on demand, and have some sort of reference in your code that goes out to whatever system you're using and grabs it and uses it as needed on demand. But just relying on these files to say secret, I think, is really asking for trouble, because more often than not, somebody makes a mistake and they get published, and then there's really very little way to ever roll that back. Now you're rotating keys, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you said it extremely well. This is not something that we should be assuming. So long as you have a practice of preventing these from ending up in your public HTML folder, right?
Yeah,
like that's not good enough. These are attractive nuisances. Like they're going to become a problem at some point if you do expose them. I would also say you should be looking at the opportunity to minimize the length of time those credentials are valid.
sure.
So, because for example, if these credentials are used for the purposes of your CI/CD pipeline, they may not need to be valid for more than a couple of hours. Now,
No. I think
reduce
15
the risk
years.
to zero.
I think 15 years is the recommended length for most secrets, isn't it? Rotate it once every 15?
Right. You're probably right.
Yeah. About the same time you change your underwear, I think, for most developers. Anyway, sorry. Slide on a Sunday, getting snarky. The other thing I would say is I would love to know more about exactly how these tools are being used. And ideally scan my own stuff, my own public attack surface, the same way the bad guys are, and find this stuff quicker than they can. Because typically they can find stuff pretty fast. Like I'm not saying about this exact one, but I've seen other cases, and our friend Bob was even telling me about one where somebody accidentally published a private something in GitHub out to a public repo, and it was found by the bad guys within hours. It's very fast. So
yeah.
I mean, you got to be careful about that. But I think it behooves us to do the same types of scans and look the same way the bad actors look to try to find that stuff.
Absolutely. But by the way, there's nothing to say you couldn't have a cron job or whatever on whatever kind of periodic job running on your web servers that just find and seek and destroy these files on a continuous basis. Mm-hmm. Perhaps connected to your HR system so that they, take care of the guilty party.
Then you accidentally delete all of the web content, and then the website goes down.
But at least your secrets are safe,
right? Can't leak if you're not up.
That's right, exactly. All right, our next story also comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is Microsoft SharePoint RCE bug exploited to breach corporate network. So the story here is back in July, Microsoft released as part of their Patch Tuesday a fix for a not spectacularly severe SharePoint vulnerability at a CVSS of 7.2. But the new news is that the CISA, the cybersecurity agency in the U.S., put it on its known exploited vulnerabilities list. And that is apparently as the result of a breach that Rapid7, who this article is written about, investigated and responded to, that found that this vulnerability was actually the cause of what appears to be a fairly highly severe system compromise. So I was surprised. One of the things I was a little surprised about was that people are exposing SharePoint to the internet. Like I thought that was something that died out in the 90s.
It's coming back, man. Like parachute pants.
Okay. Damn. And that B, you would have a Microsoft product connected to the internet that is running, some code that is vulnerable. So those were.
You're not patching rapidly.
That you haven't patched rapidly, yeah. Now, and particularly because this is apparently a relatively large organization who could afford to pay Rapid7 to respond. So I'm assuming this is not like a flower shop or like it's a. I think it's a. They obviously they don't say who the victim was, but I mean, look, I don't know how we can say we've talked about it a whole lot in the past. It's super important to limit your exposure. Like I don't know how to say it anymore. I was being flippant maybe, but like this is one of those things that should not be exposed on the internet. No, I'm sorry, it's just not.
I think this comes down a lot to attack surface management, understanding what you have out there, and understanding what's likely to get nailed easy and fast in an automated fashion, and making sure that you patch that incredibly rapidly. But
Right.
I know you're right. It feels like we're just sort of like saying the same thing over and over and over again.
There is one thing that I do want to talk about that I thought was worthy of discussion. And when you read this article, they talk about the way this breach, the sequence that this breach happened. Right, there was a RC bug. The bad actor used a publicly available exploit, which should have caused you to patch.
Right.
Okay, to upload a web shell. And then it was kind of game on. They created some scheduled jobs. They did some account discovery. They did some credential harvesting using things like Mimikatz, which I can't believe is 2024, and I'm still talking about Mimikatz. But here's the thing that bothers me, right? And maybe it shouldn't bother me, but. I'm struggling because I'm angry and
let it out.
I'm frustrated.
This is a safe space. We only have 6 listeners. No one will hear it. It'll be fine.
Why, on God's green earth, would you connect an externally exposed Windows web server of any kind to your internal Active Directory? Okay,
because it's easier to admin it.
I know it's also easier for the bad guys to just like roam around your network.
It's true.
This is the way. This is the way these advanced threats happen. Is like you don't. It's this kind of thing is extraordinarily hard to do in a Linux environment. Not because Linux is necessarily like so much more secure, and I know that there are people who will argue that point, but it's because there isn't that trust relationship between all of the different components. And by the way, I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense. Like from an operations standpoint, like it makes a lot of sense. The fact that I can disable an ID, like one of my people leave, I can disable an ID in Active Directory, and like they're no longer able to log into anything anywhere, including my external web servers. Like that's a very powerful thing.
Without a remote code.
Unquestioned. Without a remote code exploit. So I get that point, but like I think at some level we have to think more about better segmentation.
Yeah. And
this concept of least privilege, like it just feels like what's old is new again. And frankly, it's almost 2025, people.
Yeah, that's true. You can run AD much more securely than this is implying it was set up. Like AD,
yes.
Current instances of AD, and I don't even think I call that anymore. There are ways to mitigate all these problems. Microsoft isn't just shrugging their shoulders at this. Like, there are ways to do this much more safely with the concept of defense and tiered layers and segmentation and one-way trust and all sorts of ways that you could leverage this. Just nobody sets it up. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. A lot of unsophisticated, low IT capable companies don't set it up that way. And there could be lots of reasons for that. I mean, they may not have the staff, they may not have the knowledge, they may not have the know-how, we don't know who this is, or they could just be, the staff could be overwhelmed, they could have so much. This could have been a server they forgot was out there and had no idea was even still running. Who knows, right? I've seen that before. The other thing that was interesting about this attack, sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, go ahead.
One of the things the bad actors did to hide their intrusion was load a conflicting AV tool,
yes,
which shut down the existing AV tool. I'm like,
that's brilliant, by the way.
But that should be raising every alarm bell in your security stack at that point.
So one of the things that I found is very common. Organizations especially specific to antivirus. But I think it's also, even if you look at some of the more advanced, EDR, XDR stuff, they look at things that tripped the sensor, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
they with antivirus, my observation is, people do have logging. They're logging and alerting if a virus was found.
But not if it goes
and by the
quiet.
way, not if it goes quiet, right?
Right.
And by the way, there are even organizations who will say, well, antivirus, like, it detected and quarantined it, so like, no harm, no foul, and they don't even look at it. They're like, it's just something that operates because, there's this assumption that, like, if antivirus caught it, then the bad thing didn't happen.
Right.
And if it didn't catch it, then antivirus, like, is blind to it anyway. So, like, it's just something that you just run in the corner and let it do its thing. And I think that's a very obviously bad way to go about it. Like, if, especially when you have like a web server or a SharePoint server on the internet.
Yeah.
Like, if your antivirus triggers on something, like, that should be an investigation. What happened? Something happened that caused that.
Yeah. Although, to be honest, in my experience lately with EDR, 90% of the time it's a false positive, but that's a whole different conversation.
Well, yes, it is I think it's a bit different.
You still need to investigate it. You still need to understand why.
Yeah.
But then you get into a whole thing about alert fatigue and blah blah blah. But in this case, it looks like by running this competitive AV software, it just killed the existing AV software in some way. Look, you've got local admin rights. I'm assuming at this point, if you've done a remote code exploit, you're probably going to get admin rights, probably. And sure, you can shut this down. Yeah, I mean, you could probably, if you're pulling logs off the system to a centralized system and you're alerting off those, if you were clever, you could do something along the lines of watching for whatever log event might happen. But that's only based on that you know about that IOC and you're already looking for it. And this looks somewhat novel.
My suspicion is that what they were trying to hide behind, and by the way, they apparently went for several weeks without being detected. So I think they knew what they were doing for sure. But what I think they were trying to accomplish with installing that other antivirus was that the company's main antivirus agent just crashed. And so, like, even if they were looking at logs, they would probably have seen that the agent crashed, and that might not. They may like, oh geez, like McAfee crashed again. Right.
And did that generate even a log event? Yeah. It's a lot of armchair quarterbacking, 2020 hindsight, but
right.
It is interesting.
So going back to something you had said earlier, I think one of the challenges, and I've had several discussions recently about this, about the way that many organizations operate their Active Directory is the result of decisions they made back in the 90s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they're stuck with that legacy, and it's way too much time, energy, and work to update it and fix it, unless it's post breach, 100%.
Yeah, and what's interesting, it's such a fascinating concept, and it's one of those things, like I find it fascinating, but it doesn't actually amount to a hill of beans, as they say. But like the fact that it isn't until after you have the breach that you have your organization has the appetite to spend the money and go through the downtime of re-engineering things. Like, there is not an appetite, generally speaking, to do that beforehand. And so it's almost like, in government, and I haven't heard this term in a long time, but in government they used to have this shovel ready project concept, right? Like, where you wanted to have a slate of things that needed to be done and ready to go and all planned out and costed out and whatnot. Then like if money landed on your desk, like you had, and it's almost like, I hate saying it, right? But you have to have something like that ready to go in case you get breached, because otherwise you're going to be making all of those plans and decisions in a war footing.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. I mean, the challenge is for people wondering why companies don't do this. I would say the majority of companies look at that sort of activity of rebuilding our AD system with all the costs involved and all the downtime and all the disruption as a very low value activity because they rate the likelihood of a breach as low. Impact may be high, but likelihood is low. And that they have limited amount of resources and time and energy and people. And that is not a good use of capital or resources or time for most businesses. That's a very low return on investment for a maybe occurrence. Now, post-breach, it's a whole different equation, right? Everybody's in a just do something, just fix it. We can never let this happen again. And therefore, that likelihood side of that equation has gone way the hell up. And everybody's calculus changes about what's a good use of energy and time and resources. But most of these businesses are running thin, or at least no more than they absolutely need. So they don't have slack, typically, in their IT departments to go be pursuing rebuilding AD for a maybe scenario that their CISO is scaring them with versus deploying a new bit of technology that's going to make them 8% more on the next deal. And that's, I think, how a lot of businesses look at this. And I think you're right. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
So, I
Which, by the way,
agree.
Is why you get all these magic box salesmen coming in saying, slap my magic box on top of your problems and I'll stop it from happening. Because that's an easier solve. That's a one-time capital outlay or maybe a SaaS subscription to reduce the risk without actually fixing the problem. Sorry. Getting cranky.
So I think you're right on all points, but I'm left with a general sense of unease about our ability to assess likelihoods and maybe impacts. Because I just don't. I mean, obviously, after it happens, like you have certainty. Right. There's no question because it happened, and now you can quantify the impact as well. But I think we live in a different world. Like the world today for IT and organizations is just different than it used to be, and I just feel like in general, business leaders are thinking about IT risk like it were 2005. Like, you just have to be the unlucky one that some bad actor is going to target. And that's really not the right way to think about it anymore. It's operated at such an industrial scale. You've got entire crime markets of actors trying to find initial access points and then sell them into a deeper market of bad actors. So, like, it would be interesting to know, like, what percentage, as a whole, of organizations have had some kind of a bad thing, and then, like, at what rate is that increasing?
Yeah. And, not to be cynical, how many of them are like, well, we've got cyber insurance. Yeah. So we just shift that liability.
Yeah. Anyway.
This is the good news hour on security.
Yeah. Jeez. All right. The next story comes from the Hacker News, and the title here is 5 Most Common Malware Techniques in 2024. So the caution on this is that it's all about a company called Any.Run's sandboxing software or sandboxing service, which is interesting, but kind of secondary in my mind.
No affiliation.
I thought it was.
We're not pimping for them. No idea how well they work.
I actually I don't.
Yeah,
I
I've
don't.
never used it.
But I thought their observations about how or what malware is actually doing was worth talking about. The other I did want to also talk about something for a second, which I think is perhaps a little problematic. Like I think both of the last two articles we talked about were in the context of a company, like doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like not all, but much of the news we have about security stuff comes as a result of some cybersecurity supplier who's in that particular market writing, I don't want to call it a puff piece because I think that's not necessarily fair, right? But like a lot of what we get is pushed through the filter of a company is trying to make money off of the thing that happened. So that's just anyway, whatever.
No, I'm with you. It's something. It's one reason why I think, not to like blow our own horns here, but one thing that I find useful about shows like ours is we're not driven by any particular viewpoint from a vendor who's trying to sell a particular solution, whose view of the world is through their solution. Right? They define the problem as the problem they can solve, and now they are out touting that problem and how they can solve it. And that, for lack of a better term, a lot of when we educate the industry and the workforce in the industry via vendors, we're getting a biased view, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
No matter how well intentioned, no matter like even some of the best, most respected publications out there, like Verizon Data Breach Report and some other stuff like that I could call it like very well respected, a lot of great data. It's still cynically driven by an interest of selling or marketing their services to the market, right? And there are other sources of information, books that are not written by a particular organization, I think is a good one that we don't talk about. And podcasts like ours that try not to editorialize around a given sponsor. Now, sponsorship isn't necessarily evil. These shows aren't, cheap. And that's something that you and I have never done on this show, but we might on other venues, possibly, hint, hint. But that is always a challenge, right? How do you get good, non-biased, valid, useful information that isn't just shaded by a vendor's view? And I will admit, when I was in sales engineering, I even had situations where I was asked to write articles for publications like this that was very much about how the educating the marketplace, but boy, was it shaded with the tool I was pimping's abilities and nobody else's. And it's a very real aspect of the industry.
Yeah, I used to work for a manager, and I'm sorry for the diversion here, but I used to work for a manager whose perspective on education budget was that we really didn't need it because we didn't need to spend money on training because there were plenty of suppliers or vendors out there who would provide education for free. And I think, to some extent that is true, but exactly like you said, you're getting a very biased view. Like you're not necessarily understanding the actual problem. You're understanding the problem through the lens of that vendor's product or offering.
Which means they're going to emphasize their strengths and minimize or ignore their weaknesses.
Right.
And you're not going to discover the edges of their capability until it bites you, maybe.
Yeah. All right. So getting into the enough with Jerry's cynical Jerry hour here.
I think all 6 of our listeners appreciate it.
The first of the techniques that they're seeing is disabling Windows event logging. And by the way, this is not necessarily just a blanket disabling event logging completely. One of the particular pieces of malware they talk about actually enables remote access to the remote access service, and then it actually disables the logging of the remote access service. So like logging in general is still working, but they've disabled through the registry logging for that particular process or application, which I think is important to understand because, like, where I used to work, we set up like logging is super important, and having some assurance about your ability to monitor logs is very important. And so you do sophisticated things like, looking for quiet sensors.
Yes.
You'll look and see, like, okay, I have a system that's in my inventory and I haven't received a log from it in 3 days. Well, what's going on? And, sometimes it's the network cable got unplugged. Sometimes it's, blue screen. Sometimes it's, there's lots of different reasons that might happen. But in this instance, that it's a they're surgically disabling logs that would be, that would indicate their activity. And so, just, assuming that bad actors are going to completely disable logging, and then you would catch that through like that kind of a quiet sensor monitoring strategy is not a safe bet anymore.
Right. And by the way, it has to be said, like, this quiet sensor technique doesn't work for like mobile devices and laptops and such, but for servers,
true.
May be useful to know, hey, I normally get a log velocity of 28 meg per hour on this server, and it's now dropped to 0. Maybe I might want to look.
Good point. PowerShell exploitation is next. Obviously, this has been a problem for a long time. And I would say, I think the next one is command shell. I'll just kind of handle them both together. That malware tends to use applications or stuff that exists on the operating system as a means of bypassing or reducing the likelihood of raising alarm. And so if you use something like PowerShell or command shell, you would expect to see those things running on a system. Now, obviously, PowerShell, you can do monitoring, and there's lots of stuff that's been written about how to monitor PowerShell, and that's definitely worth it, but not everybody does. And so if all you're looking for is anomalous processes, and you expect to see command, cmd.exe and PowerShell.exe, you're not gonna have a sense of alarm, and so that's what the attackers here are relying on.
Yeah, I think the term I've heard often is living off the land by using tools local to the system that you're on. Yeah.
Yep, and then the next one is modification of registry run keys. I've seen this, used in some really creative ways, by the way. Like when a remote system connects to a terminal server, and that remote system's local file system is mapped into the terminal server, and if that terminal server is being controlled by an actor, that bad actor can actually add things into the startup program, which then creates registry keys, and so they can maintain persistence. But in general, this is a very common mechanism for persistence, and I think most of your XDR, EDR tools, and even a lot of antivirus, have the ability to, monitor and protect against this stuff. But, again, like if somebody installs another antivirus agent, all bets are off.
Right, indeed.
And then I thought this next one, the last one, was interesting in the context of a sandbox. So again, the company that wrote this provides a sandbox type service. It's time-based evasion. So basically, they're saying, run your questionable executables in a sandbox, see if it does anything like all the stuff that we just talked about before, for evidence of malicious behavior. And what they're saying is, well, like sophisticated malware will just wait a few hours.
Yeah.
Because your sandbox is going to time out after a while. It's not going to it's not going to keep running forever. And so if you wait more than a few minutes to execute, it's going to happen after the sandbox monitoring concludes. And so that's also an interesting. I actually, I mean, it's intuitive. I hadn't heard of this, being used in the wild. So interesting.
Yeah, I remember early days of like FireEye was one of the first big sandbox tools and whatnot, and there was all sorts of interesting techniques back at the time of things like, we'll just advance the clock or we'll run faster so that we can figure this out and solve for this, and who knows how many of those things actually caught anything in the real world versus just clever techniques that were tried by smart engineers. But there's all sorts of various ideas around this, because again, this is the trade-off of your sandbox can't run forever and things still need to get done. So how long do you hold a file before you let it finish downloading or whatever? So it's an interesting problem.
All right, the next article is from the Register, and the title here is "Sysadmin Shock as Windows Server 2025 Installs Itself After Update Labeling Error." I like after the CrowdStrike thing, this one just blows my mind.
Now, to be fair, I've had some trouble really verifying this one. Like, it seems to have had a very limited impact, and there's some oddness on it. I'm just going to say there's some yellow flags on this story in my mind, but
okay.
But
Fair.
If it's accurate, wow. So, go ahead with your summary.
So the security company Heimdall identified, or I think it was discussed in Reddit, which is probably one of the yellow flags, I suppose, that they came into work and found that some of their Windows Server 2022 systems had been updated to 2025 in an unexpected manner. And the allegation, after some investigation by Heimdall, is that this was a result of, it's not clear to me exactly in what context this was, that the Windows Server 2025 upgrade was labeled as a patch, basically. And so it was by all appearances, through some patch management system, again, assuming this is actually real, it looked like a patch that you were supposed to be provisioning, but in fact it actually was Windows Server 2025. So Microsoft apparently has not responded, and neither has Heimdall for additional information. So I have not heard any follow-ups on the story. So, but it's, again, coming after the CrowdStrike issue, this one just, it hit a raw nerve with me, I guess.
Just the trust we place in the auto update systems.
Yeah, well, that is exactly what went through my mind when I read this. Like, we have enough trouble as it is getting people and organizations on board with auto updates.
Well, look at our earlier story about that SharePoint server. If it had auto updates turned on, wouldn't have got popped, right?
True.
So we're actually arguing with ourselves on this show.
True.
But, that just argues for a planned, methodical rollout with QA environments and, test environments and prod environments. And, but again, these are difficult, non-trivial things to set up and run properly. Sorry, I interrupted your point with my diversion into our own.
So, as far as I can tell, nothing bad happened other than that some organizations ended up with unlicensed Windows Server 2025 installs that they now have to go and deal with. But, this is one of those things where, you want to do a pretty methodical and planned out test and deployment, which obviously didn't happen in these instances. So, my concern is the impact on trust in automatically patching. Like, I think we are at a point, an inflection point, where we have to start relying more and more and more on auto updates. Mm-hmm. And things that like this, again, if it's real, move us in the wrong direction, in my view.
It gives IT teams ammunition to go to their boss and say, we don't want to turn this on, even though security is telling us to. Here's an example why. This could happen to us. And they throw that on the table. And
exactly.
I mean, they're not wrong, but it also is... The reason why I'm a little hesitant on this article is we haven't seen widespread reports of this. This article came out 4 days ago in real time against the day we're recording. I don't know. This is such a huge mistake. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm saying why are we only hearing about it from one company? And it could very well be completely legit and just this one company got caught up in this one situation. But this feels like something we would see more of. And honestly, I did a few quick searches, and I saw a lot of chatter on Reddit. So I don't know. But, okay, let's just take it for completely legit at face value. Yeah, this is a problem for us because we are pushing people to patch as soon as they can because we know the exploitation against patch window is very short right now. And we don't want to build in all these, well, just in case scenarios that IT teams want to test against, which I don't blame them because of this example. So it really does help give credence to we shouldn't auto patch very rapidly, but it hurts the but bad guys will abuse you if you don't argument. So
yeah, there's
Windows.
a lot. Sorry, there's a lot of discussion in that Reddit link that's linked from the article.
Somebody get Steve Ballmer on the phone.
All right, our last story is related to something we've talked a lot about, the concept of cyber due diligence for suppliers. Like we've made
super fun topic at parties.
Oh, it's absolutely like if somebody comes up to you and says, "What do you do?" and you say, "Like I'm in cyber risk management, supplier risk management," and man,
you're the center of attention.
Yeah, they bring out the beer hat and everything. So we've talked in the past about how frustrating this is, and I think we've made fun of ad nauseum the concept of spreadsheet, the spreadsheet based questionnaires, and how frankly, like in some of the roles that I've had in the past, we had problematic suppliers. Like we had suppliers that got ransomware to compromised, and so it's always a learning experience. So like, what were the signs? Like how did that happen without us knowing that was likely to happen? Now, fortunately, never. We had our own protection, so it never really hurt us or minimally hurt our customers. But did you
ever see a common indicator that you could have asked about and found ahead of time and had warned you sufficiently, or was it so dynamic?
It was interesting. In all instances, it was that they were running old, out of support firewalls. Every single one.
Wow.
It was really becoming quite bizarre after a while. Like
patch management of the network infrastructure, really.
Yeah.
Their security.
But here's the thing. I never went and asked questions directly. Like, did show me the version of your firewall?
Right.
You
trust what they put on the sheet, right?
And
they probably all answer with, "We have a robust, vulnerability management program that does X, Y, Z."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you really don't have a lot of opportunity to get deeper into the weeds. Now, I think this is perhaps one of the potential benefits of like the security scorecard kind of, bit site kind of assessments of your suppliers. But like even that's not perfect. Like
those drive me crazy.
Far from it, you know. In fact, like we were as a, if you're any kind of a service provider where your customers are responsible for things, like it's a maddening experience because like you're getting just crap results back, and so like your the credibility that you place on these reports goes down pretty far, and they're very noisy in general.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's hard to figure out like which IP addresses are. It's not an exact science to attribute systems to companies,
especially in a cloud environment.
Yeah, especially in a cloud environment.
I cannot tell you the number of times I've dealt with a security scorecard type report that was alleging something that wasn't our IP. It's all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't even know, like, was it at one point? Did an ELB grab it at one point? I have no idea how it ever got associated with our environment, but it's maddening. And if you don't stay on top of that, by the way, as the entity that they are saying has this, then it's just out there, and people just believe it. So, I mean, you spend a lot of time correcting their bad info.
Yeah, and it's almost like a protection racket, too, because, like, if you don't subscribe to their service, you don't know necessarily what they're telling your customers about you.
Right. Until you get a report from a customer.
Until you get a report, right.
If they tell you. Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, typically it's, the last day of the quarter, you get an angry email from a salesperson saying, like, I've got this $12 trillion sale that's pending, and, and I got this report that says we're running an outdated version of Windows.
Right.
And
it says we're running on IIS 6.0. What? No, we're not.
Not that that's ever happened to me.
No.
But I think what we were lacking, and I, certainly I saw lots of different approaches to supplier management. I worked very closely with bank regulators, and they have a fairly robust sounding approach to supplier management. But I think what we've been lacking is a bit of a framework. And this story, or this it's not really an article. It's a publication by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They released a document called the NIST Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk Management Due Diligence Assessment Quick Start Guide, and it has a couple of kind of high-level categories. What I would describe as a framework to think about risk management. The first of which is to kind of break your suppliers down into tiers, and the way they recommend doing that is, tier 1 would be like your direct suppliers, tier 2 would be the suppliers to those suppliers, and so on all the way down, turtles all the way down, and then they talk about foreign. I think it's FOCI's foreign, basically foreign owned,
control,
foreign influenced.
Yep.
Yeah, and this, by the way, I think is becoming, in our current political climate, and this might not be a global phenomenon, but certainly here in the U.S., looking at how different countries play into into the supply chain. So, for example, right now, perhaps going to change, right? We in the U.S. have a deep distrust of anything out of Russia,
right?
And obviously,
and China.
And China, less so than Russia, but certainly growing. China's certainly, going up the thermometer scale. But we also have long-standing embargoes on countries like Cuba and Syria and North Korea and whatnot. And so assessing your exposure, up and down the supply chain to those kinds of organizations. And I would also say, Anyway, I'll skip it.
Okay.
I think it was more associated with the next point, which is provenance, which is basically, do you know where your systems are, where your wares are coming from?
Nope.
And in particular, I think the one of the aspects that a lot of companies don't think about is, like, after you get one step removed or two steps removed, do your suppliers all in turn rely on the same upstream supplier that could create some kind of a risk situation on you? Like, as an example, if all of your suppliers, all of your SaaS providers are hosted in the same AWS data center in Herndon, Virginia, right? Like, that could be a bad thing. And so looking for those kinds of concentration risks is an example of that. Then stability, obviously, looking at the financials. I think this is what a lot of people think about in terms of traditional third-party risk management. Like, are they going to be in business in a year? Have they been sued? Are they, do they have a history of data breaches and that sort of thing? So those are, I think, more the contemporary cyber risk management. And then they break actual cyber concerns into two buckets. And the first bucket is they call it cyber practices 1 and cyber practices 2. Cyber practices 1 is focused on I would call it open source intelligence. And this is kind of going back to your question. Were there indications of my suppliers? And this is the opportunity. Like, if I had run a BitSite report and seen that these suppliers were using a 10-year-old firewall that was way past end of life and had lots of vulnerabilities, that would have been my opportunity perhaps to see that something was wrong. And so they recommend, they have a host of different recommendations. And then the cyber practices 2 is all around the new, relatively new, executive order around secure development practices. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge push by the government as a result of a Joe Biden executive order several years ago around attesting to development practices, and lots of and I think it's mandatory for companies that want to sell their software into the U.S. government. They have to attest to.
Isn't it part of like FedRAMP now? I think.
Well, I think it is part of FedRAMP, but it's basically any time you want to sell software into the government, even if it's outside of a cloud service, you have to have this attestation in place. So, but this is not perfect, by the way. Like, this is like a version. To me, it's like a version 0.1 of a plan. But I can see like something coming together. It's like it is a tangible step in a direction that I think is good. It actually offers some questions to ask, makes some actionable recommendations. It's not just like the normal fluff that we've seen coming. So I actually like this, and I know I did a crappy job of explaining it, but I am, I've not always been a big fan of things put out by NIST in this space, but I kind of like where they're going with this.
I wouldn't say it was crappy. Was it your best work? But crappy seems harsh. I mean, you know what? We'll discuss it in a review this week. So, a couple thoughts. I in general agree with your kind of view on this. I also wonder how often. Let's say you assess somebody, and you assess them as weak or substandard or whatever you decide. Like, wow, these are. I mean, how often do you think that actually stops a deal for a company? And that's individual to each company, right? Like, how powerful is their third-party risk management team? Is one of the questions. Like, I always am curious about. And the other thing I think about is, for a lot of people today, they typically answer these types of questions with something like a SOC 2 report, where they like, look, we've got an outside auditor who's already audited us. Here's their attestation of our, concurrence of meeting all these different standards. Trust them. Go do this. And do you find that trustworthy? Good enough?
Well, I would say, SOC 2 really slots into
or similar. By the way.
That practice, like ISO 27000 SOA,
sure.
SOC report, whatever. I see those as kind of fitting into that cyber practices one, right? Like that's, and even so, it's not like most of those are testing you against your policies, right?
Right.
And
you
so,
do
like,
what you say you're going to do.
Yeah. So, like, okay, I've got SharePoint. I've got a vulnerable version of SharePoint on the internet, but it says that I can do that so long as the right level of management signed off on it. Right. And I can show that the right level of management signed off on it. Therefore, I met my policy. And so they're not necessarily performing qualitative assessments on the decisions that you're making. They're looking to see, have you made? Do you have reasonable processes in place and are you following them?
Right.
And so that I think that's the hole that I have long saw with things like SOC 2.
Yeah.
They're great. And by the way, like this is something that I think we struggle with as an industry, because if you think about a service provider, they don't have the ability. I mean, unless the services become breathtakingly expensive, they don't have the ability to entertain auditors from every one of their customers, and so they have to use something like a SOC 2. It's just the way it is. Yeah. And on the other side, companies that are, paying, a $5,000 a year for a cloud service don't want to employ $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000 a year auditor to go and audit a $5,000, the supplier that's supplying $5,000 service. Like, that's also not very valid. So I think we're stuck having to do something like that, but I don't think it meets the mark. I think it's an input. I think it's if they don't have it, that should raise alarm. But if they do have it, you shouldn't say everything's great. They have their SOC 2.
Yeah.
That's the world according to Jerry.
Yeah. Yep. I think it's fair. I think it still comes back down to how can you ask a right question and get an honest enough answer to make a valid risk decision that also doesn't change in 5 minutes?
Yeah, because it's not static. I mean, it's a good point. It's a good point.
So, I struggle with third-party risk management. Now, from a cyber perspective, some of the other questions I think are a lot easier to determine, like what's the financial stability of the company, the ability of the company to consider keep going as a growing concern. Are they owned by some other entity that we don't trust right now, like Russia or China or whatever? I get that. But I think the cyber stuff is just a lot of, frankly, hand-waving to make it look like we did something. And I don't know how effective those programs really are, honestly.
You asked the question, so how often is it that a risk management function would have the ability to stop a deal with a supplier that they find to be dangerous? And I would say, I have seen it. I have seen it, and it's ugly, by the way. It can get ugly. and sometimes does get overwritten as you might expect. But at the same time, if something bad happens, like that's Exhibit A, like you knew, like you can't at that point you can't, like you got nothing to hide behind. You knew, you did due diligence, and you found a concerning thing and you ignored it, and so like you proceed at your own peril. I'm not saying that that's necessarily unreasonable to do in all instances, because like, if it's a company that's managing your lunch menu, like, it's probably not a big deal. But if it's like the company that's handling the personal health information of your customers, and you find something concerning, that's probably not a good thing, because you could be in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. So I think it comes down to risk, and it relies on the leadership of the company having the right mindset when they're making these risk decisions. And so, as we know, some make bad decisions, and so I think that probably more often than should happen, that the decision is made to continue on using suppliers that have concerns. Yeah. Just the way it is. The dice. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, that is the show for today. I hope this was useful to you, despite my stammering.
I just get you so worked up and just out of sorts.
It's you. It really is you.
That's fair. And yet you knew that, and you did your due diligence, and yet you still invited me to the show and keep inviting me back.
And here I am. That's right.
You knew what you were getting.
So anyway, thank you for being here. Hopefully you still like the video format. If you like us and like what you hear, please give us some love on whatever podcast app or format that you're looking at, you're watching this or listening to this through. You can find links to all the stories we talk about on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can find Mr. Callett where?
I'm on X and infosec.exchange at lerg, L-E-R-G.
Good deal. And I am at Jerry at infosec.exchange. And by the way, I have to say, we have had quite a few new people signing up to infosec.exchange over the past probably 2 weeks, citing that they're coming here because they listen to the show.
Wow.
So that's pretty cool.
That is cool. Hopefully, it's worth it to them. And
yeah.
They should say hello. Don't be shy.
Exactly. Anyway, we will talk again soon. Thank you all very much.
Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.